Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. Imagine a homeowners association that's been dead for 20 years suddenly coming back to life, led by a power-hungry neighbor who wants to charge everyone thousands in zombie debt. He sued me to get the money, but my lawyer found a single sentence in the state law that not only saved me but destroyed his entire HOA. I need to start by saying I never thought I'd be the kind of person who gets into a fight with a homeowners association. When my wife and I bought our house about 5 years ago, we specifically looked for a neighborhood that didn't have an active HOA. We'd heard enough horror stories from friends and family about petty rules, power-hungry board members, and endless fees for services nobody wanted. Our real estate agent assured us that while the neighborhood technically had an HOA on paper from when it was first developed back in the 80s, it had been completely inactive for at least 15 years, maybe longer. No meetings, no dues, no enforcement of any kind. The previous owners confirmed this. They said the last time anyone had heard anything from the HOA was sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s, and even then it was just a poorly attended meeting where nothing got accomplished. After that, it just sort of faded away. People moved in and out, and nobody bothered to keep it going. That sounded perfect to us. We loved the neighborhood itself. The houses were well maintained, the streets were quiet, and our neighbors seemed friendly without being nosy. The lack of an active HOA was just the cherry on top. We could paint our house whatever color we wanted, park our cars in the driveway, and generally live our lives without someone sending us violation notices because our mailbox was the wrong shade of black. For 5 years, everything was great. We settled in, made some friends on our street, and never gave the defunct HOA another thought. The covenants were technically still on file with the county, but they were so old and outdated that nobody paid attention to them. One of the rules said you couldn't have a satellite dish, which was hilarious considering half the neighborhood had them. Another rule limited you to 1 dog per household, but our neighbors 2 doors down had 3 and nobody cared. Then everything changed when a new family moved into the house at the end of our street. I should have known something was up when I met the husband for the first time. My wife and I went over with a plate of cookies to introduce ourselves, which is just what people do in our neighborhood. The guy, I'll call him Richard because that's close enough to his real name, answered the door in khaki pants and a polo shirt tucked in so tight it looked uncomfortable. He was probably in his mid-50s with that kind of uptight demeanor that makes you tired just looking at him. Richard thanked us for the cookies, but immediately started asking questions about the neighborhood. Not normal questions like where's the best grocery store or what's the school district like. No, he wanted to know about property values, neighborhood standards, and who enforced the rules. When I told him we didn't really have enforced rules because the HOA was dead, he got this weird look on his face. Not disappointed exactly, more like he'd just been presented with a challenge he was eager to tackle. An HOA is never really dead, he said, which should have been my first warning. It just needs the right leadership to bring it back to life. I laughed it off at the time, but Richard wasn't joking. About 3 weeks later, every house in the neighborhood got a letter. It came in an official-looking envelope with important HOA information printed on the outside. Inside was a letter on fancy letterhead that said Sunset Meadows Homeowners Association across the top, which was apparently the name of our neighborhood's HOA that nobody had used in over a decade. The letter announced that the HOA had been reactivated by concerned homeowners who wanted to preserve property values and maintain neighborhood standards. There would be a mandatory meeting the following Tuesday at the community center to discuss the HOA's plans going forward. The letter was signed by Richard as the new HOA president, along with 2 other names I didn't recognize as vice president and secretary. My wife and I talked about whether we should go to the meeting. Part of me wanted to just ignore it, but another part was curious about what Richard thought he was doing. In the end, curiosity won, and we decided to attend. The meeting was awkward from the start. Out of about 60 houses in the neighborhood, maybe 20 people showed up. Most of them looked as confused as we felt. Richard stood at the front of the room with a laptop and a projector, acting like he was presenting a corporate business plan rather than talking to his neighbors. He had clearly put a lot of work into this. He had charts showing property values in neighborhoods with active HOAs versus those without. He had photos of houses in our neighborhood that he considered eyesores, including one belonging to an elderly couple whose lawn wasn't as perfect as Richard would have liked. He had a whole presentation about the importance of standards and uniformity and protecting everyone's investment. Then he got to the part about money. The newly reactivated HOA would require annual dues of $500 per household. This money would go toward neighborhood improvements like new entrance signs, landscaping for the common areas that barely existed, and legal fees to properly establish the HOA's authority. Legal fees. That should have been my second warning. Several people raised objections right away. A woman 3 streets over pointed out that nobody had agreed to reactivate the HOA and asked what gave Richard the authority to do this. Richard had an answer ready. He said that according to the original covenants filed with the county, any 3 homeowners could form a board and reactivate the HOA at any time. He had researched this carefully and consulted with a lawyer to make sure everything was legal. Someone else asked why we needed to pay dues when the HOA hadn't provided any services for 15 years and nobody had been asking for them. Richard said that was exactly the problem. The neighborhood had been allowed to decline in standards, and it was time to fix that. He said the dues were necessary to fund the improvements he had planned and to build up the HOA's operating budget. The meeting went on for another hour, with Richard deflecting every objection with references to the covenants or vague statements about property values and neighborhood pride. By the end, most people looked frustrated but resigned. A few said they'd just pay the $500 to avoid trouble. Others, like me, left without committing to anything. 2 weeks after the meeting, another letter arrived. This one was more formal and significantly more aggressive in tone. It stated that the HOA board had been properly established according to the covenants, that all homeowners were bound by those covenants, and that annual dues of $500 were now mandatory. The letter included a long list of new rules and regulations that the board had voted to enforce, covering everything from approved house colors to acceptable lawn ornaments to parking restrictions. But there was something else in the letter that really got my attention. Buried on the second page was a line item showing our total amount due. It wasn't $500, it was $8,000. I read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. There it was in black and white. Current year dues, $500. Back dues assessment for 15 years at $500 per year, $7,500. Total amount due, $8,000. I actually laughed out loud when I saw it. It was so absurd I couldn't believe it was real. But when I called the phone number listed on the letter, Richard himself answered, and he confirmed it was completely legitimate. He explained that just because the HOA hadn't been collecting dues for 15 years didn't mean those dues weren't owed. The covenants required annual dues, and the fact that previous residents hadn't paid didn't erase the debt. Those unpaid dues accumulated over time, and now that the HOA was active again, it was time for everyone to settle their accounts. I pointed out that I had only owned the house for 5 years, so even if his logic made sense, which it didn't, how could I possibly owe 15 years of dues? He had an answer for that too. He said the dues attached to the property, not the person. When I bought the house, I inherited not just the house itself, but all obligations tied to it, including unpaid HOA dues from previous owners. When I asked if he seriously expected every homeowner in the neighborhood to write him a check for $8,000, he said yes without hesitation. He'd sent the same amended statement to everyone. He acknowledged that some people might need payment plans, which the HOA board was willing to work out on a case-by-case basis, but one way or another, everyone would be paying what they owed. I told him I'd need to consult with my lawyer before I paid anything, and he got noticeably irritated. He said I could waste money on a lawyer if I wanted, but the covenants were clear and legally binding. He strongly suggested I just pay the dues and avoid making things more difficult for everyone. That's when I decided I wasn't paying a single penny. I'm not usually a confrontational person, but something about Richard's attitude and his absurd demand for $8,000 brought out a stubborn streak I didn't know I had. This wasn't about the money, really. $500 would have been annoying but manageable. $8,000 was insulting and clearly predatory. And beyond the money, I didn't like the idea of Richard and his little board dictating how I could live in my own house. I found a lawyer who specialized in property law and HOA disputes. His name was Tom, and when I explained the situation to him during our first meeting, he listened carefully without interrupting. I brought all the letters from Richard, a copy of the original covenants I'd pulled from the county records, and my closing documents from when I bought the house. Tom looked through everything methodically. He spent a lot of time on the covenants, reading certain sections multiple times and making notes. Finally, he looked up at me with an expression I'd later learn meant he'd spotted something important. "Let me ask you something," he said. "When exactly did you buy this house?" I told him the exact date, just over 5 years ago. He made a note, then asked another question. And when was the last time this HOA was actually active before this recent reactivation? I mean, really active, collecting dues, holding regular meetings, enforcing rules, any of that? I told him what our real estate agent and the previous owners had told us, and what everyone in the neighborhood seemed to agree on. The HOA had been completely inactive for at least 15 years before we bought the house, possibly longer. Nobody could even remember who the last board members were. Tom smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile lawyers get when they found the thread that will unravel everything. They just made a critical mistake, he said. Possibly several critical mistakes, but let's start with the obvious one. I need to do some research on state statutes and case law, but I'm fairly confident we can fight this. In fact, I think we might be able to do more than just get you out of paying. We might be able to kill this whole reactivation attempt. He explained that there were specific laws in our state about abandoned HOAs. When an HOA goes completely inactive for an extended period of time, typically more than 5 years, there are legal consequences. The HOA doesn't just automatically spring back to life because someone decides to reactivate it. There are procedures that have to be followed, notifications that have to be sent, and in some cases the homeowners have to vote to approve the reactivation. More importantly, there are statutes of limitation on debt collection. If the HOA hadn't collected dues in 15 years, they couldn't just suddenly claim everyone owed back dues for all that time. That's not how debt works. You can't ignore a debt for over a decade and then suddenly demand payment plus 15 years of accumulation. Tom said he'd need a couple of weeks to research everything thoroughly and put together a formal response to the HOA. In the meantime, he advised me not to pay anything and not to communicate directly with Richard or the HOA board. Any communication needed to go through him. I left his office feeling better than I had in weeks. Just knowing that Richard's scheme might not be as airtight as he claimed was a huge relief. About a week later, Tom sent a formal letter to the HOA on my behalf. I didn't see the full text, but he told me the main points. The letter stated that the HOA's reactivation was legally questionable and potentially invalid. It stated that the demand for back dues had no legal basis and was unenforceable. It demanded that the HOA cease all collection efforts against me immediately and warned that any attempt to place a lien on my property or take other action would result in a lawsuit. The letter apparently got Richard's attention because 3 days later, Tom received a response from a lawyer representing the HOA. This lawyer claimed that everything the HOA had done was legal and proper, that the covenants gave the HOA broad authority, and that my refusal to pay dues was a violation of those covenants. The letter threatened to place a lien on my property if I didn't pay within 30 days. Tom wasn't impressed. He told me the HOA's lawyer was using standard intimidation tactics, but didn't actually address any of the legal issues he'd raised. We decided to wait and see what happened after the 30-day deadline passed. In the meantime, I started hearing from neighbors about their own experiences with the reactivated HOA. Most people had received the same $8,000 demand I had. Some had called Richard to complain and gotten the same dismissive response I'd gotten. A few people had actually paid, either because they didn't want the hassle or because Richard's threats about liens and legal action had scared them. Then Richard made another move that turned out to be a huge mistake. About 6 weeks after the initial reactivation, neighbors started telling me about a new letter they'd received. I didn't get one myself, probably because Richard knew I'd lawyered up, but several people showed me their copies. The letter announced that the HOA board had voted to assess a special one-time fee of $2,000 per household. This fee would fund several major projects, including new entrance monuments at both entrances to the neighborhood, professionally designed landscaping for those entrances, and the repainting of all curbs throughout the neighborhood in a uniform color scheme. The letter said this special assessment was mandatory and due within 60 days. Combined with the $8,000 in regular and back dues, Richard was now demanding that every household pay $10,000. People were furious. Even the neighbors who had been willing to go along with the $500 annual dues felt like this had gone too far. A few of them asked me about my lawyer, and I gave them Tom's information. Within a week, Tom had 3 more clients from my neighborhood, all fighting the same battle I was fighting. This turned out to be important later, because it showed a pattern of behavior from Richard and gave us more ammunition for our case. The HOA never did put a lien on my property, despite the threats. Tom explained that putting a lien on someone's property requires following specific legal procedures, and the HOA probably realized they were on shaky ground. Instead, they filed a lawsuit against me and the 3 other homeowners Tom was representing. The lawsuit demanded payment of all dues, including the back dues and special assessment. It also sought to force us to comply with all HOA rules and asked for attorney fees and court costs. Richard apparently thought a lawsuit would scare us into settling. It had the opposite effect. Once we were actually in court, everything had to come out in the open. Tom filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit based on the arguments he'd been making all along. The HOA was improperly reactivated, the back dues were unenforceable, and the entire scheme was legally invalid. The discovery process was particularly interesting. Tom requested documents showing when the HOA had last been active, who the previous board members were, what the HOA's finances looked like, and what procedures Richard had followed to reactivate it. The HOA's lawyer tried to avoid producing some of these documents, but the judge ordered them to comply. What came out was revealing. The HOA had no financial records at all from before Richard's reactivation. There were no meeting minutes, no correspondence, no evidence of any activity whatsoever after 1998. Richard had essentially created a brand new organization and claimed it was the continuation of the old HOA. More damning, Richard hadn't followed even the basic procedures outlined in the original covenants for reactivating a dormant HOA. The covenants stated that if the HOA had been inactive for more than 3 years, reactivation required a vote of at least 60% of homeowners. Richard had just appointed himself and 2 friends to the board without any vote or input from the neighborhood. When we finally got our day in court for the motion to dismiss, both sides presented their arguments. The HOA's lawyer had a thick binder full of documents and spent nearly an hour arguing that the original covenants were still valid regardless of how long the HOA had been inactive. He cited several cases from other states where dormant HOAs had been successfully reactivated. Tom was more concise. He focused on our state's specific statutes about abandoned HOAs and the statute of limitations on debt collection. He walked the judge through the timeline showing that the HOA had been completely defunct for at least 15 years, possibly 18 or 19 years, based on the lack of any records after 1998. Then Tom asked the HOA's lawyer directly when the HOA had last been active before Richard's reactivation attempt. The lawyer gave a vague answer about not having exact records, but claiming it didn't matter because the covenants were still valid. The judge wasn't satisfied with that answer. He asked again, more pointedly, when was the last time this HOA actually functioned as an HOA? When were the last dues collected? When was the last board meeting held? The HOA's lawyer finally admitted he didn't know exactly, but that it had been at least 15 years, possibly longer. The judge asked one more question, the same question Tom had asked me months earlier in his office. When did these homeowners purchase their properties? Tom provided the closing dates for me and the other 3 homeowners he represented. All of us had bought our houses at least 5 years after the HOA had gone dormant. The judge looked at these dates for a long moment, then looked at the HOA's lawyer. So your clients are trying to collect dues that were supposedly owed before these homeowners even bought their properties? Dues that were never collected, never demanded, and according to your own admission, weren't even pursued for more than 15 years. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue that the dues attached to the property, not the person, but the judge cut him off. He said he'd heard enough and would issue a written ruling within 30 days. 3 weeks later, we received the judge's decision. It was a complete victory, even better than Tom had expected. The ruling was 12 pages long and systematically dismantled every argument the HOA had made. The judge found that the HOA had been improperly reactivated without following the procedures outlined in the covenants. He found that the statute of limitations barred collection of any dues from before the reactivation date. He found that even the current year's dues were invalid because the HOA itself was invalid. Most significantly, the judge ruled that the HOA had no legal authority to enforce any rules, collect any fees, or place any restrictions on any homeowner in the neighborhood. The original covenants were still on file with the county, but without a properly functioning HOA to enforce them, they were essentially meaningless. The judge also ordered the HOA to refund all money it had collected from homeowners who had paid dues, and he ordered the HOA to pay our attorney fees, which by that point were substantial. Richard tried to appeal, but his own lawyer apparently advised him it was pointless. The judge's ruling was thorough and well supported by state law and precedent. An appeals court would almost certainly uphold it. The best part came a few weeks after the ruling when neighbors started receiving refund checks in the mail. The court had ordered the HOA bank account frozen and appointed an administrator to return all collected funds to the homeowners. Richard had to provide all financial records showing who had paid what. Several neighbors told me they got their full $500 back, plus interest that had accumulated in the account. Richard never did get his entrance monuments or his painted curbs. The whole scheme fell apart, and the HOA went back to being dormant, probably permanently this time. The judge's ruling made it clear that any future attempt to reactivate would require a proper vote of the homeowners, which nobody was interested in organizing. As for Richard himself, the whole experience seemed to break something in him. His wife apparently wasn't happy about the legal fees they'd racked up or the embarrassment of losing so publicly. Within 6 months of the court ruling, their house went up for sale. They moved away before it even sold, and I never saw either of them again. The neighborhood went back to the way it was before Richard showed up. People maintained their properties because they took pride in their homes, not because someone was threatening them with violation notices. Our property values stayed steady and even increased over the next few years, despite Richard's dire warnings about what would happen without HOA enforcement. I learned a few valuable lessons from the whole experience. First, just because someone sounds official and confident doesn't mean they actually know what they're talking about or have the authority they claim. Richard did his research, but he either didn't understand the limits of that authority or chose to ignore them. Second, when someone demands a large sum of money from you, especially for something that seems questionable, it's worth spending a little money on a lawyer to check whether that demand is legitimate. The few $1,000s I paid Tom was far less than the $8,000 Richard wanted, and it saved me from years of dealing with an invalid HOA. Third, and maybe most importantly, communities work better when people choose to be good neighbors rather than when they're forced to comply with arbitrary rules. Our neighborhood was perfectly fine without an active HOA because people generally cared about their properties and respected each other. Richard's attempt to impose structure and control didn't make anything better. It just created conflict and resentment. These days, when I see the house at the end of our street where Richard used to live, I think about how differently things might have turned out if he'd just been content to be a normal neighbor, if he'd introduced himself without the khakis and polo attitude, if he'd joined the neighborhood instead of trying to control it, if he'd asked people what they wanted instead of telling them what they needed. But I guess some people just can't help themselves. They see something they think is wrong, and their solution is always more rules, more control, more authority. They never stop to consider that maybe things are working just fine the way they are. The Sunset Meadows Homeowners Association letterhead that Richard created now sits in a folder in my filing cabinet, along with all the threatening letters, the court documents, and the final ruling. I keep it as a reminder that standing up to unreasonable demands, even when it feels easier to just pay up and move on, is sometimes exactly what you need to do. And every time I pull into my driveway and see my house with its non-HOA approved shutters and my non-regulation mailbox, I'm grateful that my lawyer knew to ask one simple question that unraveled Richard's entire scheme. When was the HOA last active before this reactivation? The next one is a pro-revenge story. My landlord was a terrible human being. Honestly, calling him a human is even pushing it. Just a few things he has done to me over the past 3 years. Stole my dryer and other household products that are in a common area. Made me pay for a plumbing repair, which was deemed normal wear and tear. Tried breaking into my house. Retaliated against me because I went to my lawyer after he sent me a letter about a parking spot. He tried charging me an extra $150 a month. Mind you, I was never late for rent in 3 years, except for when he made me pay for the plumbing repair, so the next month I was a couple days late. The list goes on. Now this apartment was nowhere near nice. I found out the plumbing was illegal, he left me with a porch for years that has severe safety issues, the ceiling paint was always falling down, gas heater was not up to code, and so on. I finally got my chance to leave after he wanted to raise my rent $500 a month. He will do anything and everything to get more money out of his tenants. So I called the building inspector 4 days before I left. I told him everything. The porch, when he finally replaced it, didn't have a permit and was definitely not up to code. I told him about the plumbing and the heater. I went on and on. The inspector came over the very next day. I saw him taking measurements. Each violation is a $500 a day fine until fixed. I honestly don't know what happened, but my God, did it feel good to finally get him back. He's at the very least on the town's radar. A week before I moved out, he tried telling me I needed to be out at a specific time. I never responded, and where I lived, that's not how it works. He tried to threaten me with the police if I wasn't gone. Well, I went to the police myself that morning to warn them. The landlord did come by, threaten me, and harass me. I called the police. They informed him I was in the right. Long story short, he had broken into my apartment. I had left to go to storage. While I was gone, he nailed my door shut. I told the police to get the supervisor because I was over being harassed by this guy. Go figure he left before the supervisor could get there. I'm positive he knew he'd be arrested on site. Got the police report. They're charging him with a felony for breaking and entering. Fines plus a charge? Don't be a jerk to good people. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So for some backstory, I have problems with writing out things by hand. I don't know exactly what it is, as I don't particularly want to get it checked out. The reason for this is just due to not wishing to waste the doctor's time when they have more important things to do. I've suffered with this problem for about 4 to 5 years, and I'm a 16-year-old biological male. The problem is that when I write for extended periods of time, 10-15 minutes, I get extreme cramps in my hand that leaves me unable to move my fingers until they subside. Usually I can feel them coming before they happen, so I can put the pen down first and stop it from fully happening. I also have problems with handwriting as a result and cannot write very quickly. I'm studying for my exams at home and do all my work on a laptop to avoid problems with my hand. I'm proficient at typing with one hand as to avoid the problems with the other. My grandmother, who we'll call G for the rest of this story, is always saying I work too slowly. I start work at 9 a.m. and am done at 8 p.m. depending on what the work is. Yesterday she blamed my lack of working quickly on the fact that I'm on a laptop and can obviously write quicker than I type. This is not the case. When she said the next day that I would not be typing an entire English transactional writing piece, I tried making my point to her and she wasn't listening. Here's where the compliance comes in. The next day, today, when I had sat down to do this writing piece, she took the laptop from in front of me and put lined paper down. I had 50 minutes to write it all out, and so I was grinning from ear to ear, knowing what was about to happen. I started to write and everything was going well. I wasn't trying to be slow and I was going quicker than usual. I felt my hand start to cramp and told her about it, to which she huffed at me and told me to just get on with it and stop being a hypochondriac. And so I did, and not less than 2 minutes later my hand cramped and locked up. It continued like this for 8 minutes, and while it was extremely painful, I tried to keep quiet in order to let my plan work. When the cramp subsided, I continued on with my work, and it happened again. I think all in all it happened 3 times before my time was up. I had written a single 8-line paragraph, which had just shy of 130 words in it. She was not pleased, and so told me that I was going slow on purpose just to piss her off, to which I explained again, and she finally let me do it on my laptop, to which I got 3 paragraphs plus a conclusion in those 50 minutes while typing with one hand. The next one is an entitled people story. I worked in electrical retail in a mall in England back when the Wii console first came out. When it was first released, if you are old enough, you'll remember that the handsets didn't come with a safety strap attached at all. You just held it in your hand loose to play the games. It had a thin strap with it, but no one ever attached them. So about 3 days after the release of the Wii, a couple came into the store literally carrying their big LED TV, seriously high-tech at the time and very pricey, under their arm, and put it on the counter of customer services and demanded to see the manager. Sadly, this was before the Karen name tag existed. We asked them what the problem was, and they pointed to the giant crack on the TV screen and said it had just mysteriously broken. We said that unless they had an extra warranty, that accidental damage was not covered. They replied all snootily that the TV just broke. The kid with them sniggered. They refused to talk more unless to a manager. It was busy, so he'd be a while. I told them to browse. They left the kid with me. Gee, thanks. So I chatted a bit to the kid till I softened him up. Then I straight up asked the kid, 9 or so, what really happened. He said, "Well, I was using my new Wii, and the remote flew out of my hand whilst I was playing 10-pin bowling, and it crashed into the screen on the wall and smashed it." I was utterly astounded. Luckily, a coworker had also heard what the kid said. At that point, the manager came up to me, and before the parents could come storming back over, I quickly told him the real story. Then the parents arrived and began to bullcrap the manager utterly. "The screen just broke whilst we were out." Manager was a good bloke and said, "Well, your kid just told us that the Wii remote flew out of his hand into the screen." Cue parents looking at the kid like he was gonna be grounded for a year. The kid was still smirking, as 9-year-old lil craps are bound to do when getting someone else into trouble. Whilst this was going on, I actually had taken the time to look at the back of the TV and saw that it wasn't even a model number that we sold. I quickly turned to my manager and said, "This TV isn't even one we sell here." The manager looked at parents and asked what exactly they thought we could do if the telly wasn't from this store. They both started yelling over each other, saying that it was all our fault and that they shouldn't have to replace it, but still trying to say nothing about the Wii. Our manager stonily said that there was literally nothing we could do as they hadn't even bought it from us, so how could we replace it? They were both so crossed lines and agitated that they started being utter Karens and crappy at us. I could tell manager was 5 seconds from calling mall security when the dad said, "Well, we bought the Wii from you and that was what caused the accident, so you have to replace it." Ah, so you do admit it was an accident caused by your kid on his Wii? The parents both just looked at each other, and the mom looked so pissed at Dad. And the mom took the kid's wrist and went to storm out of the shop, shouting at Dad to follow them. My manager called after them, "Hey, you can't leave the TV here, it's littering!" I think he just pulled that out of nowhere because he was utterly pissed off by that point. "If you leave the TV here, we'll contact mall security and you'll be banned from the entire mall." There were other malls in the city, but ours was the biggest with all the best stores. Dad just huffs and comes to retrieve it, and they both get escorted out of the store by our own security. A few weeks later, Nintendo sent out stickers to put on all the Wii boxes to always attach a safety strap, and a few months later, all Wii remotes started being shipped with straps attached already. I think there were a lot of broken TVs at this point, but I bet we were the only store to have a couple ask for a new TV at a store they never even bought it from. Anyway, thank you for watching.